hypnosis with real clients facing genuine issues. Brought to you by the hypnotherapist demanded by celebrities, CEOs, and even royalty, Adam Cox. These recordings took place live from Adam's clinic in London's world-famous Harley Street. So, get yourself comfortable and enjoy today's episode of The Hypnotist.
Hi, it's Adam here, and you're about to listen to a podcast episode that I was featured on by a fellow hypnotherapist called Astrid. I have seen Astrid at all of the other hypnotherapy conferences. She's a very good speaker. She's been on my show before talking about tinnitus, and she was asking me about my thoughts on nested loops, on metaphor, on levels of disassociation, and why I use the movie Inception as a structural metaphor to talk about nested loops. So if you're a hypnotherapist, but if you're just interested in therapy or how people can weave stories within stories or how I structure some of my hypnotherapy sessions, you might get some value from this session. So find a quiet, comfortable place where you're not going to be disturbed, relax, and enjoy the session.
It is recording. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of Mind Explorations. Mind Explorations is a podcast that came out of a Facebook group that you can join if you would like to join us live, like about 15 people are doing right now. And I'm speaking here with, Adam Cox, who is himself a podcast host of the Hypnotist podcast on Spotify, but what you might not know, he's also a hypnotist, or surprisingly, and he's going to talk to us today about levels of dissociation and nested loops, and that is one of those mystic things that every hypnotist learns or doesn't learn, and we're going to shed some light on how you can use them and make it easy to use them for your next client. So, hello, Adam. I'm glad you're here.
Glad to be here.
Wonderful. So for anyone who doesn't know you yet, apart from what I've just said, would you just introduce yourself? How long have you been in the business and what do you do?
Yeah, so I've been a hypnotherapist for about 12, 13 years. Got into it just because it helped me, basically. And found it really, really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So 12 years ago, you started, you got studying with got your basic training, and then you've probably trained a lot more. And you've worked in Harley Street, or you do work from Harley Street?
I used to.
So what happened
now
there?
Pretty much all online.
Yeah. So with the pandemic, I'm just reading off your information, really. So you used to work in Harley Street. So that's a pretty good part of London, and that means you are one of the good quality hypnotists, really. And I'm going to cut that part out. And right. So now you're working online, and you're working with people all over the world. And what do you specialize in?
A lot of anxiety, a lot of weight loss. Phobias. A lot of phobias as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, and now we're going to get straight into the subject of nested loops. What interested you in nested loops?
For me, a nested loop is a story within a story. And you can't really talk about nested loops without talking about open loops. So for me, an open loop is something incomplete, is something unfinished. A good example of that could be clickbait. So a lot of you will see articles online and there will be a headline, and that headline will kind of allude to something, but you can't figure out what it is unless you actually kind of go into the article. So clickbait is kind of an open loop or unfinished gossip. A lot of people will have heard the beginning of a story, and right in the middle of that story, someone kind of holds back and they say, well, I shouldn't have told you that. Like, forget everything that I've said. But because you've heard a little taste of that, you then get really, really interested, even more interested than they told you the whole story, because it's not quite finished.
Mhm.
So these kind of things are open loops, a teaser. It could be a riddle that you don't know the answer to, a wrapped present that you kind of, as a child, would have shaken just to kind of imagine what was inside. All of these are kind of open loops because they're not quite finished. And what a nested loop kind of does is it has one story, opens up a loop, and then begins a new story. And then within that story, opens up another loop and then perhaps starts a story. Most people know at least one person. There's a bit of a raconteur, a bit of a storyteller, and they can't stick to one theme. So they'll go on tangents or they'll
Mhm.
digress into a different area. That can be frustrating for people to listen to someone that never gets to the end of what they're talking about. But it also is quite compelling because you're listening to someone and then you're like, oh, where's this going to go next? And of all the hypnotherapists that I think are naturally wired that way, I would say Richard Bandler, he can't start at the beginning and get to the end. Like it goes off on all these kind of digressions and tangents. But by doing that, what it does is it kind of brings you in and it
Mhm.
can almost create a confusion induction, or it requires so much attention to kind of figure out where you are. The way I was taught nested loops was in almost like a linguistic way, like a linear way, that you start story number one and you kind of go into story one. And then before you finish story two, you open up story two. Before you get to the end of story two, you open up three. And then when you get to the end, you kind of go backwards and you start closing off story three or story four, then go back, close story three. A lot of hypnotherapists like the idea of doing nested loops, but they don't do it because there's this feeling that it's a lot of work to do. And also, if you're memorizing stories and metaphors within that, there's this kind of feeling of, well, how do I how do I know this is even going to be relevant to the client in front of me? So a lot of people have a almost a conflict there where nested loops sound great because it's quite creative and it kind of quite Ericksonian, weaving in lots of metaphors, but it kind of seems too much hassle. So for me, what really changed how I was thinking about nested loops, um, early on in COVID, I think a lot of people took up hobbies in COVID, and my hobby was a podcast because I was at Harley Street. The rent was high. It was quite a prestigious location, but there's no point paying all that rent if you're not seeing clients face to face. So from my perspective, I kind of wound that down, but I really wanted a creative outlet for hypnosis. I already had a podcast at that point called Modern Mindset, but I thought, okay, what I'm really passionate about isn't about mindset, it's about hypnosis. So I created a podcast called The Hypnotist, and the early episodes are me sharing my weight loss, kind of sessions, protecting the confidentiality.
Mhm.
What really changed though is when I started taking inspiration from movies. And the first movie that I used as kind of inspiration for a hypnosis session was Limitless with Bradley Cooper and Robert De Niro, about this idea that you take a pill and you can kind of
Oh yeah.
tap into your full potential. And I did a few, but my favorite film, it's still in my top five films, is Inception. And I think a lot of hypnotists really resonate with Inception because it's this idea of accessing the subconscious, dreams within dreams. And when I turned the storyline of Inception into a hypnosis session, it was almost like the two Venn diagrams kind of almost became an eclipse, because it was like the structure of a nested loop and the structure of the storyline of Inception
Mhm.
almost mirrored each other, because you've got these kind of storylines, but they don't quite finish before they start up a new storyline. But what I found really, really fascinating is one key distinction. And that key distinction in Inception is, it was kind of a thought as I did this, and it was, how difficult would it be to follow the movie Inception if all of the levels were based in a similar environment? If they're all in streets, or if they're
Mm.
all, in the snow, or if they're all in a hotel. What makes it easier to follow if you're an audience member of Inception is this element that you can kind of figure out where they are in the dreams, which dream they're in, based on the location that they're in. And what I found is that that then helped me to think about nested loops in a different way, not based on traditional linguistic story one, story two, story three, but levels of disassociation. And the levels of disassociation for me is that you start off in one environment and then you have some kind of a vehicle that gets them to a different environment. And a lot of people do this intuitively in hypnosis. We're trained to have a deepener, and that deepener might have some kind of a staircase. So, but quite often the staircase just gets you down to the end of the staircase. But why can't a staircase be, because we're dealing with the imagination, you could be, lots of people like to start their hypnosis in a place that they feel comfortable with, like a beach or near a lake. You could have the staircase literally going from the sand underground to a different context. Now, what this kind of does is dovetail with mnemonics, because one of the things that's quite helpful if you're memorizing things is to make them absurd, make them odd, make them kind of different. And it's weird to have a staircase going down on a beach because you would think, right, the staircase is going to be filled with sand. It would do in reality, but in your imagination, it can just be, okay, there is a staircase going from the beach. That makes it very easy to remember. And I use Hansel and Gretel as the metaphor as to why people don't use nested loops. If you remember the story, they get lost in the forest and they're relying on breadcrumbs to find their way home. And I think a lot of people are worried about having story one, story two, story three, because it's kind of like if they lose track of where they are, they can't get back to the beginning. And then there's a feeling of failing as a kind of hypnotist. You don't really want to do that if you've got a client in front of you. So what I found is that there are two key distinctions that makes my nested loops different from the average nested loop. One of them is, rather than thinking of stories within stories, I look at it in terms of levels of disassociation. And then the second distinction is that I'm using the vehicle to get from one level of dissociation to another as some form of mnemonic, some memory tool. And I quite like using symbolism, because symbolism naturally is quite easy to kind of introduce on a story. And you know, we see this in fiction all the time. Like if you think of the you know, Narnia, for example, you know, kind of how did they get from their kind of stately home into this kind of magical land? It's at the back of a wardrobe. Okay,
Yeah.
that would be,
And everybody remembers because it's a wardrobe and not a staircase or a door.
yeah,
Yeah.
and not just a conventional door. There and it's there's something magical about that. Equally for Alice in Alice in Wonderland, it was a rabbit hole, and Alice through the looking glass, it was a mirror. So these ideas, and you could ask someone that hasn't seen, you know, Alice in Wonderland or kind of like the Narnia kind of story, the Chronicles of Narnia, how do they get from like their reality to this imaginative world in Narnia? And they're like through a wardrobe. And it could be years since they've read the book or kind of seen the movie, but there's something about that that demonstrates that it's a mnemonic. So if that can last for years, it can definitely last in a 45-minute hypnosis session. So you can use these tools to get from one level of disassociation to another level of disassociation, knowing that it's pretty easy to remember, because you can use the absurdity of why does one thing bridge to another when it doesn't normally do that? And you can use things like elevators, you can use fireman's pole, children's slides, you can use absolutely anything, but you want to have something that means that these become the breadcrumbs in Hansel and Gretel that aren't going to be eaten by the animals. Like they're still going to be there when you think back to them.
Yeah. Right. So just for anyone who doesn't know the movie Inception, because I remember it from seeing you at the UK Hypnosis Convention, could you just give us a quick storyline and the levels that they go through, the scenes that they go through?
Yeah, the premise is it's a reverse heist movie. So a classic heist movie is that you've got to take the gold or the money from the vault in the bank. This is a reverse heist. The premise is that instead of taking something, you're putting a seed of an idea into the mind of someone that it's beneficial to do that. And there is this billionaire owner of a huge conglomerate that is about to die. He's got an heir that is going to inherit all of that. And there are vested interests that would benefit if that company gets broken up. So the concept, the premise of the movie is to put a seed of an idea into the mind of this heir, played by Cillian Murphy, who you probably know from like Peaky Blinders and lots of movies, 28 Days Later. So it's a seed of an idea planted in his head. But lots of Chris Nolan's movies are quite well researched. There's this idea, and I think as hypnotists we get that if you just give someone a suggestion in normal waking life, um, generally it's rejected. We try that, you'll say that, people say it to themselves. Why can't I just lose weight? Why can't I do that in a completely conscious state? And they wonder, why doesn't that work? There is this kind of idea in hypnosis that you want to get them to some different kind of, whether you call it a state or a feeling or enhanced neuroplasticity, something where that suggestion is more likely to be taken. And the premise in Inception is that they want to go about 5 levels deep. And if they go 5 levels deep, an idea that wouldn't stick at level 1 or level 2 would be accepted kind of deeper down through different, not just the dream within the dream, but the dream within the dream within the dream within the dream. So they have this machine that enables people to kind of access people's dreams, but they can do it more than once. So they can have the machine in the dream, which means that you can have a dream within a dream within a dream. And it's quite complex to follow, but it is helped by the fact that they are in different locations. So what you would call the reality level in the movie Inception is a flight from, I think they're going to New York, so they've got this flight, and the open loop there at that level is, can they get everything done before the flight lands? That's kind of like the open. And also, is the person going to remain asleep throughout the whole journey to make this thing happen? So there's a bit of jeopardy at that kind of level. So that's on the plane, and then the next level down, they're in the back of a van, and this van is being driven around the streets, but it's being pursued. So you're not on the plane now. You know that you're in the back of a van, but then there's this extra open loop of, are they going to get caught? And you've got this extra, kind of element of jeopardy that a jolt wakes everyone up, what they call the kick. So this van is rushing around the streets, and that's the kind of element as a watcher, you're like, oh, are they going to wake everyone up? Is this plan going to fail? So you've got 2 open loops there. But then they hook someone up in the back of a van, and that takes them to a hotel. And in the hotel, they want to get a combination lock, so that they can kind of access certain, kind of things. So, and each level deeper has this idea that it gets more distant from reality. So in the van, it kind of abides by the laws of physics. But when they get to the hotel, you've got kind of hallways kind of morphing and all of this, and they start floating and things like that. And then when they're in the hotel, when they've got the combination lock, then they hook up one of the characters to this machine. They're now in that person's dream. And in that dream, they're in a snow fortress. And the snow fortress also contains a hospital bed, which happens to contain the dying billionaire conglomerate owner. So that when the Cillian Murphy character is in that hotel in the snow fortress, he's able to kind of hear the last dying wishes of his father that he was kind of estranged from. So it makes it feel like it's his idea to kind of do something, for environmental reasons and other things. So that's something that he buys into, but essentially it leads to the outcome of breaking up that. Now, you've also got a couple of other open loops at that point. One is this whole Leonardo DiCaprio storyline of, how did his wife die and did she really commit suicide? But then he has to escape the snow fortress and ends up in this kind of apocalyptic world of kind of falling skyscrapers, what they call limbo. And it also has this kind of open loop that if you can't get out of that, you stay there forever. Now, the last time I saw Inception must have been about 6 years ago. It was actually about 5-6 years when I did the episode. I've not seen it since I did the episode of hypnosis. And I can still recall the different levels because it becomes a mnemonic. Storytelling is a form of mnemonic anyway, but then you've also got levels of disassociation. So all of that helps. The fascinating thing, and I think there's a bit of irony there, is that it's all about kind of nested loops and level and dreams within dreams. But the movie even ends with an open loop. He's got this little kind of spinner that goes round like a totem in the movie they call it to figure out are they in reality or not. He sees his kids for the very first time in years, and the spinner is still spinning. So you're left when the credits go down of, is this
Right.
real or is he still in a dream? And I think that's a wonderful thing to kind of end the movie
Mm,
with that.
mm,
Now, that kind of element, a lot of people can kind of figure out, okay, it's quite easy to kind of see if you're watching that, how the different scenes are kind of different. And at the end of the movie, what they effectively do mirrors very closely with what you're meant to do in nested loops, which is kind of tie up the loose ends of one and then go back to the next level, tie up
mm.
the loose ends, then go back to the next level. So it really is a good metaphor for nested loops. And I would encourage anyone that wants to do more nested loops to kind of watch the movie. It's a great movie anyway. Some great actors in there, and it's really helpful to kind of have a framework to think about nested loops. Where I kind of take it a bit further is that you could just use the movie Inception, but being in a snow fortress or being chased by kind of bad guys in a van isn't normally the kind of experience that people are expecting. So
Yeah.
what I do is I tend to kind of find levels of disassociation relevant to the client, and generally it's linked to resource states or the metaphor that I'm going to use. So if I've got a client very stressed, I'll ask them the question in the pre-talk and the diagnostic element is, has there been a place in the last few years that you felt incredibly relaxed on that place?
Mm,
Quite often it tends to be a place in nature. It tends to be like a beach or near a mountain or a lake, things that are quite easy to remember. And that becomes the level one of the first level of disassociation. It's not reality because they're not in their presence. But when they start connecting with a memory that they've got good associations with, they can get to that place pretty easily. And then you
mm,
could have some kind of device where you say, and on that beach is a door and it's not connected to a building. How strange is that? But let's count from 5 to 1 and go through that door and find yourself somewhere else.
mm.
And what I tend to do is to help me with the breadcrumbs to kind of find my way back. I tend to alternate between nature and somewhere that's indoors. So if it's nature at the first level, I tend to make it indoors, so it has an element of contrast. Um, is that making any sense at all?
It is
Hopefully,
making sense. I don't even need to interrupt you, but yes, so that's the way to make it easier for hypnotherapists to memorize where they are. Does it make a difference for your client as well to have a very different um, place, very different location each level?
yeah. I think it helps to personalize the experience,
Hmm.
because I think if I was a client and I was being read a script at, it's going to feel very generic.
Yeah.
Whereas if, and you can use lots of other kind of modalities and kind of techniques within these levels of disassociation. Why not do regression at level 3?
Mm-hmm.
Why not do future pacing at level 4? Why
Yeah.
not do an element of, if they've got a phobia or extreme anxiety, rewind technique, you know, you could have that kind of cinema or that screen or that kind of other version of them,
Mm.
at level 4 or 5 in this kind of process. But the personalization of it makes it feel engaging. And I also think there is a danger of hypnotherapists, like when you've seen, a few hundred clients and you've kind of got a little bit on autopilot. If
Yeah.
you're doing very similar techniques and very similar phrases, then there's a danger that you're not fully present with the client. But if you are making it a little bit more cognitively difficult for yourself by framing these levels of disassociation, well, you've got to figure out where you are. You've got to remember the symbolism that gets you from one to another. You've got to personalize it. You've got to remember which open loops you're opening and those kind of things. And by making it a little bit more challenging, it means that you've got to pay more attention in the same way that if you're riding, if you're driving a car on the motorway and the weather is worse, you tend to pay more attention than if it's like a sunny day because
Yeah.
you kind of need to. So it can create an extra level of mindfulness from the practitioner to enable them to do it. And the one of the main benefits for me is that I find it more fun. I think I would be bored seeing client after client if a lot of the techniques are too similar. So this kind of adds a little element of creativity. And the side effect for me, where I have a little bonus, is because a lot of the sessions I publish on my podcast, there is an extra element of, well, if I'm seeing yet another client with the same issue, I could do a very similar kind of structure of techniques for that client. But because the levels of disassociation are different, it
Mhm.
creates an entirely different experience for the client,
Yeah.
for me, but
Mhm.
also if any audience was to listen to that podcast episode.
Yeah.
Most people are looking at the superficial level, the surface level, not the structural level. So structurally, it might be very similar, but superficially, it would look like an entirely different
Mm.
hypnosis session.
Absolutely. So I've got some questions that I wrote down while you were explaining everything. So if I were a beginner, I would ask you, why do we need levels of dissociation?
You don't need them. I would
What are they
say,
good for?
yeah, I think they can be beneficial. And, um, I would say there is an element of them being, I use an acronym kind of deep. So I'm going to bring it up here so I can refresh my memory. So depth of trance is clearly a metaphor. You can't measure trance in kind of inches, centimeters, and those kind of things. But people that do hypnosis a lot notice differences between someone like really immersed in an experience. And you can kind of tell from facial expressions and body language, someone that's like, am I really in hypnosis? Like they're still kind of chatting in their head.
Mm,
If you give them a few levels of disassociation to get through, and they're kind of like they're in their reality, you pace their experience in the room, and then they're connected to a memory, and then in that memory, they're somewhere else, and then there's someone else. It encourages them to kind of be in that place. So in a way, it does take them into a deeper experience, and the metrics for that might be hypnotic phenomenon. You might see the levels of relaxation or their eyelids or some kind of clues as to kind of where they're at. Um, I think there's a high level of engagement. A lot of clients, um, if it was just that kind of induction with very long progressive relaxation, they could still be in their head and saying like, oh, this is taking too long. This doesn't feel like
mhm,
hypnosis. If you're giving them something, and that's why I call my way of doing levels of disassociation the Inception induction, because it becomes an induction and a deepener. When I started, the average length of my hypnosis sessions were about 45 minutes. These days, they're around about 20 minutes. Because if
mhm,
you get them to the fourth or fifth level of disassociation within the first 3 or 4 minutes, it can kind of get them to that place and they feel engaged.
mhm,
At least that's what I pick up on. And when you've got at that kind of fourth or fifth level, I believe that they are more suggestible to suggestions at that point. And whether that's embedded commands, whether that's metaphor, whatever it is, I think if you try to do that at the very beginning and you just close your eyes, relax, and imagine that you are the phoenix rising from the flames, like if that's an immediate thing, it
mhm,
might break rapport a little bit. If you introduce it kind of later down, it tends to have this ability to be accepted more. And I mentioned personalization. I think it's a way to give them a real experience. And I appreciate that hypnotherapists will use different techniques. I tend to use a lot of metaphor and a lot of storytelling in my approach.
mhm,
Therefore, what I feel is that if I'm going to give them a story, make it incredibly relevant to their specific situations, their resource states, their ideal future that they want. So for me, I'm weaving these stories, but they're very, very calibrated to the individual that I'm working with.
mhm,
And then the bonus for me is that it's more fun for me and creative. But I would say it's not necessary. If you tend to be someone that uses predominantly idiomotor responses and direct suggestions, I would say this probably isn't the right tool. But if you are more Ericksonian, if there's more metaphor and storytelling, if you like, that kind of taking them on a bit of a journey in their imagination, this could be great for that. But the wonderful things that I like about hypnotherapy is that there isn't the right way. And it makes me
yeah,
laugh when you get these kind of preachy dickheads saying like it has to be done this way. It can be done however you want it. And that element of I like doing it this way. And I can guarantee you that there'll be other people that say, what's the point? You don't need all this storytelling. You don't need all these levels of disassociation. Just kind of do a rapid induction and just tell them authoritatively that
Mm.
their issue is gone. It's what works for individuals, but I like this style.
Mm. Yeah, well, everybody's got their style that they like. So you said you personalize the sessions and you calibrate to the client. Um, that means your interview at the beginning uh, is probably quite extensive. So how would you, um, yeah, how do you match the different levels and the different places? Whatever you use, plane, van, hotel, whatever it is, how
Yeah.
would you match that to the client?
So how I tend to structure roughly a 60-minute session is that um, it's that whole adage of, kind of measure twice, cut once. I spend twice as much time asking the questions and kind of figuring
Mm.
out the outcome, trying to identify blocks or kind of issues before. So 40 minutes of a 60-minute session is me asking lots and lots of questions. I'm kind of
Mhm.
typing away. And then normally the session itself is 20 minutes. And generally, level one is a place that they know well, that they have positive associations with. And I encourage them, I kind of prime them to expect it to be in nature. And I tell them it's because when you think of nature, it tends to, be conducive to more oxytocin. Have no
Yeah.
idea if it's true. They believe me every time, but it just means that that first level is more likely to be a place in nature. And it tends to
Mm.
be beaches and mountains and lakes and things like that, or gardens is parks, another popular
Yeah.
one. And then level two tends to be something very different. But now I'm starting to think of what kind of approach am I going to use with the client. So if I know that I'm going to use, let's say, levels of disassociation and things like that, I might say, right, and there's a door that leads to your own private cinema. Um, and if I am going to use the cinema or control room of the mind, I'm asking them questions in that first 40 minutes. It's like, did you have a favorite cinema as a child? Or
Mm.
when I say the word control room, what comes up for you? Is it something like mechanical with lots of kind of
Mm.
levers and gauges, or is it futuristic like in Minority Report? Like what comes up for you? So that when I take them to that place, I'm not having to kind of guess what's going to build
Mm.
rapport with them. Again, it makes it more personalized. Um, I tend to have a lot of, I'm a big fan of the kind of Melissa Tears approach of associate into the problem state, disassociate from the problem state,
Mhm.
disassociate from the resource state, and then associate into that. Well, within that, you've actually got opportunities for levels of disassociation
Yeah.
that can also be nested loops, depending on how you structure them and how you open a loop at each level. If you do inner child work, why not go back to a memory and disassociate? And now you're in a childhood home. Well, that's an extra level of disassociation. So you can kind of, weave in that as well. So depending on what the client issue is, that's what determines the levels. I never go into a session, thinking, right, it will be a beach and then it will be a control room and then it will be this. Like it's entirely dependent on what comes up in that 40 minutes.
Yeah.
And generally towards the end, I like to do future pacing, but I like to do future pacing that is disassociated. So they see
Mm.
themselves like they're someone else with the change having been
Yeah.
made. And only when
Yeah.
they're convinced that that is a future that is desirable, they'll give me some kind of response like a nodded head. And then I'll say, right. And then step into that future version of you, try and emphasize just to make sure that it does connect and feels good. And you can't think of any reasons why that wouldn't be good. So you've got all these different levels of disassociation, and most hypnotherapists are using lots of levels of disassociation, but it's done in kind of like if you think of a lot of movies, they will have a scene, they'll go off on a storyline, and then they'll go back to the main storyline, and then they'll go off.
Mm.
I think that's how a lot of hypnotherapists are using disassociation. They'll disassociate,
Mm.
associate back to the default. When you use nested loops or levels of disassociation, you're kind of you're opening one and then creating another one and then creating another one.
Mm.
So, that's what makes it different. You haven't quite finalized the earlier bits before you're doing the new bit. And some of the things that I like to introduce to create very simple open loops at the levels, because if it's just a level of disassociation each time and there's no open loop, it doesn't quite map across to a nested loop. So,
Mm.
for example, with weight loss, clients, for example, if they are on a beach, I'll say, and for some reason there is a puzzle, one of these jigsaw puzzles, and it's there. And I want you to
Mm.
see the logical analytical part if you're trying to solve that puzzle. And then we go off to the next level of disassociation. But there's a little thought in their head, what's the puzzle? What's the puzzle all about? How do I solve the
Mm.
puzzle? But then when I get them back to the beach, quite often the suggestion that I use for weight loss is that there is an image of you losing weight and enjoying the process. And it dawns on you that all the time, the most effective way to lose the weight isn't to lose weight to be happy, it's to happily lose weight. Now, if you've opened that loop at the beginning and then you close that loop at the end, that hits them. It
Mm.
really resonates because it feels like it was incubating all that time, that when you go back to it, it really kind of resonates. Whereas if I just gave that suggestion that you will happily lose weight really early on in the session, it loses its impact. But if you open the loop, there's a puzzle that's going to reveal something really empowering. And then
Mm.
they discover that it means that they need to happily lose weight and enjoy the process. It hits different than if it's just direct. So
Mm.
open the loops at the different stages can enhance it.
Okay, so before we go into open loops, I'd like to go back to, you said that some hypnotherapists go back to the main timeline or back to the main thing and then go back off to the next thing. So that would be comparable if we go into metaphors to going through a corridor and opening one door, then back to the corridor, opening the next door. That's what you say
Yes,
others
it's a
do.
great
And you just
metaphor.
go from
Yeah.
room to room to room in that
Yeah.
way.
And
Yeah.
and 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 you could say that the nested loop version of that is that you're in the corridor, you enter one room, but then in that room there's another door that takes you to a different
Mm.
room, and then in that room it takes you to, and then that's kind of like levels of disassociation.
Hmm.
Whereas if you resolve the issue in room one, go back out of the room, back in the corridor, go into room two, it still involves disassociation, but it doesn't
Yeah.
have
The
levels of
depth.
disassociation of
Yeah.
of the equivalent of dreams within dreams.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, so open loops, what do they do for the client, for somebody who doesn't know?
Yeah, well, I think every person has had the experience of being on the receiving end of an open loop. Think of someone that you're interested in romantically. You send them a message, they read the message, but they don't respond. That's an open loop. You're like,
Mm.
but they've read it. Why aren't they responding? Why? And all these questions start firing off because it's not quite complete. Or it might be, um, you know, so again, I use the example of gossip because I think a lot of people can relate to that. But it's getting a bit of information,
Mm.
cliffhangers at the end of a soap opera or a TV show. Like the psychology of a human is crazy because we would be reluctant to watch a 3 hour movie, but we will binge watch three 1 hour sessions on Netflix, one
Mhm.
after the other, because the Netflix, we want to know what happens next, but it's bite-sized chunks. So those cliffhangers create this thing. And, there's an element of kind of Gestalt psychology there. It's that element of the incompleteness gives us discomfort temporarily. And that's why
Mm.
we've got a desire to kind of tie up the loose ends. I believe, and I know there's lots of kind of spiritual people in the hypnosis community. I believe that one of the main reasons that people go to a psychic after a bereavement is they're trying to close a loop that
Mhm.
can't be closed anymore because that person's dead. They can't have the conversation that needs to be had. But if the
Mhm.
psychic tells them, and they're here and you're forgiven, whoop, close loop.
Mhm.
Okay, I think a lot of what happens in psychic circles is more like hypnosis than anything kind of paranormal, in my opinion.
It
Um,
does seem so very often, yeah.
yeah, it's
There's
induce
a
a
lot of
trance state,
overlap.
expectation, all of those things. So
Yeah.
we all know the power of an open loop. The open loop, it feels uncomfortable until we get the solution,
Mhm.
and a lot of people are sold things based on, okay, you've picked at the scab, you've identified a problem, but there isn't a solution yet. But there's
Mhm.
hope that there's a solution, right? Get your credit card out and kind of do it. It's a psychological phenomenon that explains why most most social media content, most kind of online news channels use clickbait as a title is because humans
Mm.
respond well to an open loop that can be closed. It can also be a form of frustration because it's like, you
Mm.
could have just told me that. Why did I have to do this thing? In email marketing terms, a lot of us will use a lead magnet, because why do they put the email in and click submit? Because they want to get the thing that you've opened the loop for, and that's in the solution. So why
Mhm.
are open loops important? Because they work on humans is the honest answer. And if they
Yeah.
didn't, we wouldn't use them. But can you weave that to make hypnosis more engaging? Well, if it creates motivation and engaging, like you're clicking an article that you don't really care about because there's a tiny bit of curiosity, well, that kind of principle probably would work quite well in a
Mhm.
hypnotherapeutic session as well. So open loops have the ability to influence, engage, generate curiosity, inspire them to take action. And, it can be quite compelling. Like I remember I'm a big movie fan. Even an average movie, why do I stick to the end? Because there's several open loops that, most movies will kind of there's almost like an epilogue. They close up a lot of the open, and it's only if there's a franchise, particularly Marvel, they close all the loops and they open a few at the end to make sure that
Yeah.
you watch the next movie.
Yeah.
It's all
Definitely.
it's all psychology, but it can be quite powerful. And I think that's why I use a combination of open loops and nested loops. And the distinction being, an open loop is incompleteness, and a nested loop is either a level of disassociation or a story within a story.
Hmm. Okay. So they're quite powerful then. And how does that improve results, have you found?
Well, I think one of the ways it does is engagement, because I remember early hypnosis sessions and I'm saying the words at them, but I'm reading their facial expression of almost kind of like the micro expression of, like, has it started yet? Like, what's happening? And I don't get that these
Mm.
days. When I weave these kind of stories in, they seem invested in the story. And it almost becomes like one of those choose your own adventure books, because it's calibrated to them and they've got some autonomy. And this is one of the things that I like to do, is introduce within the nested loops an element of choice. It's kind of like, if you think of, again, Alice in Wonderland, she could eat, one bit of food or the other bit of food, but the element
Mhm.
that she had choice creates this element of agency within
Mhm.
the thing. So quite often, the levels of disassociation, it could be, right, there's three doors, but you choose which door you go through.
Yeah.
And again, that tends to kind of have them more engaged into the process. So that's what I've noticed, at least.
Mhm. Do you give your clients active choice, like as in asking, would you like the bread or the cheese? Whatever you're giving them a choice of. Sorry
Yeah,
about
you,
that.
you you
Food.
can do, but it's easy to frame that as a double bind,
Hmm.
because you get to decide what the impact of that thing is. So in a way, like a lot of those choose your own adventure books, there's the illusion of choice, but after two or three choices, it takes you back to exactly the same kind of story arc. So, but
Hmm.
but it's that element of, you know, like, for example, you can load the dice, and if one of the options is the status quo, things
Yeah.
happening exactly as they are, but you frame it as a decision, you can
Hmm.
keep on doing things exactly as they've been going, knowing exactly where it's going to take you, or you can choose to make a change. If you'd
Hmm.
like to see what that future looks like, let me know by nodding your head.
Okay. Yeah.
They're in front of you. They don't want the status quo. Otherwise, why are they in front
Yeah.
of you? So you get to kind of create a catalyst, a permission for them to yeah, kind of come out and kind of have a bit of agency. Sometimes I'll make it very broad. So if I'm using um, like an orchard or a garden with fruit, I'll say, like, and there is a particular fruit that you want to eat that contains a resource that you want, and I don't
Hmm.
know which one you're going to pick, but I want you to make that choice now. So again, you
Hmm.
can kind of create those kind of choices within them, but that's just an element. How you can create that as an open loop, it could be one that I quite like is like a treasure trove, and it's kind of like, and there is something in there that you're going to choose, and it contains a resource that's going to be very useful for you later.
Hmm.
You pick it up, you put it in your pocket, but you don't know exactly what resource that's going to give you. until your unconscious reveals it through some kind of epiphany or insight, and that will come later. Well, now the open loop is a post-hypnotic suggestion that they're going to get some kind of realization, but you can
Mm,
weave that within the storylines of the session.
right. So when you go down the levels of dissociation, I'm just going down in my head. Do does do the later levels of dissociation do they hold more weight for the client? Would you build something more into that, or the more important subject to solve?
I think it depends, and
Hmm.
there's a couple of frameworks that I kind of use. If it's kind of for those familiar with Robert Dilt's logical levels,
Yeah.
early,
Oh,
kind of influencer of kind of NLP, you've got this idea that, at the extremities, you've got environment and behavior, and then it's kind of thoughts, beliefs, values and identity. So
mm,
a helpful framework that I find is that at the lower levels, it's more useful for making identity level changes about
mm,
who they are at their core. And most people can kind of connect to that. If they just kind of say an affirmation at themselves in the mirror, okay, that's not a particularly deep experience. That affirmation is probably going to be more likely to be effective if it's about your behavior of what you're going to do right now.
mm,
But if something is really, if you just say in the mirror, I'm unstoppable, you might not feel that the same way that you're going to say, I'm going to smile right now. Like, so
yeah.
behavioral. So what I tend to do as a broad thing is that the more identity and the value stuff tend to be like further in the deeper levels of disassociation, around the mid-level belief
Mm,
systems. And I'll always try and work at belief systems over behavior, because behavior, I liken that to post-hypnotic suggestions in a stage hypnosis show. Like, it's not, the idea isn't that they're going to last forever. It's kind of like a temporary thing. Whereas if someone believes something, quite often the behaviors will naturally flow from that belief
mm,
system. So for me, I tend to kind of have the belief systems in the middle. If the change that they're making is kind of something they don't fully understand, I tend to do it at deeper levels. If it's something that they're kind of aware of, it might be closer to the top. But I don't really kind of mathematically structure this. It's just kind of
mm,
intuitive. But I think there is a use for things that they're either very resistant to. Generally, at parts therapy, for example, in a child work, I tend to do that, at around like 3 or 4 levels of disassociation rather than kind of 5 or 6. But
yeah.
if it is like real stuff about, there's a fundamental change in terms of the identity that they're activating or discarding, that in my experience tends to be more effective if it's kind of more levels of disassociation.
Hmm. So do you have a specific number of levels you take your clients down, or for specific issues, or how would you decide, okay, today I'll go 10? No, as a
Yeah.
kind of random number.
I think the only reason to do that is if it's become a challenge to do that. And I remember on one particular session, I set myself the challenge of how many levels of disassociation can I can I get? And I think it was like 15. And I think I will attempt, just because it would be a good thing for like a potential like viral video to say, right, can you do like 50 levels of disassociation and kind of remember all, something like that. But in all honesty, you get diminishing returns after about 4 or 5. So if you're
Hmm.
doing loads and loads, like, why introduce the additional complexity if you're
Hmm.
getting diminishing returns on the value? Probably not
Right.
much, unless it's an ego thing and you want to, like, oh, I'm going to do 12 levels of disassociation. Like, okay, good for you, but does it benefit the client more?
Yeah. No, so what's usually the best way, 5 or 6? Is that, I mean, you've got more experience in nested loops, I suppose, than anyone on this call. So when do you find does the value go away of introducing more levels? Or how do you tell by on a client, in a
Well, I
client?
think I think the element is the key metric of success should be the client in front of you. So
Mm,
if you're testing for changes, if you're um, you know getting a sense of what does it take, and sometimes you can do that if they feel anxious in a particular situation and
Mm,
you're 5 levels deep and you say, right, now think of that spider, try and feel anxious if you can. And they can't. What's
mm,
the value of taking them another 2 or 3
right.
levels? I saw a message there from Steve with
Mm,
the
Mike
Mike
Mandel.
Mandel's kind of
Mm,
keynote. And it's been at least 3 or 4 years since I've heard the recording of that, and I
mm,
can still remember. I can still picture the scene of the child throwing one more starfish back into the ocean, and it's been years since I've heard that. Like that's the power of a good nested
yeah.
loop session. Mike and Mike is how I learnt the linguistic way of doing nested loops. But he has a little tactic that he does where he will take them back to a loop that they haven't actually experienced to give them the idea that they're experiencing amnesia, that they
Mm.
can't remember the original level. That's a nice touch, like, to
Explain. Sorry.
so
I
so
think
so
I just
let
had
let's
amnesia.
let's say, for example, that level one is a beach and level two is a cinema, and then
Hmm.
I take you back in reverse order and then say, and now you're on the beach, and then you climb up the ladder to that tree house where you remember all along. Now, there was no tree house in the original beginning of the
Hmm.
nested loop. So to now
Right.
introduce an extra level when there wasn't one, they're like, I can't remember the tree house. And then it can be framed to be this kind of extra, oh, wow, like that must have been really
Hmm.
deep because I can't even remember the tree house the first time. So it's a,
Right.
it's a nice touch. And I think Mike, anyone wanting to learn the traditional way of doing nested loops, I think Mike Mandel is excellent about.
Hmm. Wonderful. Yeah, we've got some comments here. Sorry, it's a bit late now. So, Zeigarnik effect, I guess that's the open loops. And somebody says had to look that up to close the loop because the Zeigarnik effect is, do you know what that is, Adam? I
I'm
believe
not
Steve
familiar
would
with it.
tell
I'm
us.
going to have to. There's an open loop there for me too now.
There you go. Everybody look it up when you're done. And the meta pattern, yeah, that's the associate to the problem, disassociate, etc. That's what that is. And then Guy says, very much as Freddie Jacquin says of hypnosis, evoke an emotion, give a suggestion.
Yeah, and after doing the talk on nested loops at the Irish hypnosis conference, Freddie was talking about some training and sessions that he does that uses this idea of kind of architecture and it was exactly like levels of disassociation. So you kind of in one thing, and that could be anything. It could be you're seeing a picture, you climb inside the picture, and inside the picture you see a doorway, and at the end of the doorway there's a door. And each time you go through one level, it's an extra
Yeah.
level of disassociation. So it has parallels with nested loops, but it also has parallels of just thinking, right, can you give a new threshold to take them to somewhere new? And that's how
Mhm.
you can easily get to kind of 21, 50 kind of things. It's not
Mhm.
whether or not you can do it or not. It's kind of like, is there any additional value at doing something at 21 levels deep that you can't do at
Yeah.
7? That
Yeah.
would be my way of thinking about it. And if there isn't, well, then now it just becomes, a dick measuring contest for the sake, oh, I can do more levels. But, do you need that?
Mm, right. Um, so before I say anything else, guys, if you have questions, please ask them. Um, because we're gonna be finishing within the next 10, 15 minutes, I think, about. Blurna Zeigarnik, Lithuanian psychologist, noticed waiters remembered clients that had not yet paid their bills far better than clients that had paid. And oh, Carmen is asking, Adam, metaphors from movies. What if a movie opens or triggers a wound for the client? Or a metaphor?
Yeah, and that's more dangerous um, if you're doing it to large audiences. So at HypnoThoughts, not HypnoThoughts, at the UK Hypnosis Conference,
Hmm.
I used the phrase helter skelter, which in the UK means one of those kind of fairground rides. It's a slide that kind
Yeah.
of goes round. And I think it was Frederick Mao came up and he said, like, his association, that was the kind of Charlie Manson kind of killers, the kind of healthy, and it didn't even kind of make that connection to me at all.
Yeah.
What I would say, Carmen, is that when I'm working one on one, if I'm using a movie metaphor, I'm testing the water with the client beforehand, or I'm noticing stuff. And I remember using a Doctor Who metaphor for a client, And it was because the client that I was working with, I could see like Doctor Who posters and a little kind of little mini TARDIS on the wall behind them, and it's kind of like that's going to be very safe.
Hmm.
As you know, the TARDIS is a level of disassociation. It also has the connotation that you can go through space and time, so you can do timeline stuff. But if I just gambled and say TARDIS to someone that isn't familiar with Doctor Who, they're not going to know. They'll be
Hmm.
like, is you going to break
Yeah.
rapport instantly? So you have to kind of test this kind of stuff. Um, Whereas you can take the structure of a metaphor. One of my favorite structural metaphors from movies is the hero's journey. And one of the things I like about the hero's journey is this idea that whatever breakthrough you make will be tested.
Hmm.
And that could be courage, that could be self-belief, that could be confidence, that could be a change in behavior. That's the smoker that becomes a non-smoker. In the hero's journey, right? Them meeting their nemesis is um, going back to, hanging out with their friends and they get offered a cigarette while they're tipsy. It's kind of
Hmm.
like that's the test. And the
Yeah.
true evidence of the change isn't the change that we make in the session, it's that it will be tested in reality. Now
Yeah.
that's a structural metaphor rather than a specific movie because Lord of the Rings has the
Hmm.
hero's journey. John Wick has the hero's journey. Like so many movies have that
Yeah.
loose structure. So if you want to be safe and not be specific, you want to be like movie agnostic. It's themes, overcoming adversity, meeting the nemesis, and the nemesis could just be a conflicted part within themselves, or whatever it might be, a coping mechanism, but keep
Mm.
it broad.
Yeah. Would you do parts in a session in one of the levels?
Oh yeah, yeah. I
Hmm.
love parts, and you can use kind of parts that use submodality kind of shifts. So you could like imagine the part, give
Hmm.
it a physical representation, and it might be someone looking very timid. You could kind of say that.
Hmm.
One of the places I used to do a lot of parts therapy is they're on the beach, and then you say, right, and you notice a little shack on the beach, a wooden shack, and you go
Hmm.
up, and you have them waiting outside the shack, and when you go in, the part responsible for whatever it is going to be waiting there, and then you
Hmm.
open up or you allow them in, and then you invite the part in. So you can do that if it's visual elements. Um, one of the questions sometimes I get asked is, more and more people are familiar with aphantasia, and because I'm quite visual in my metaphors, it's like, does it work if you've got someone that has difficulty visualizing?
Hmm.
In my experience, it's fine, but you've got to be careful with the predicates that you use rather than, and
Yeah.
then you're seeing this. It's kind of like I tend to, I'm lazy in a way, so I just use the word
Hmm.
imagine rather than see,
Yeah.
hear,
Or
and that kind of
notice.
stuff
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
they, aphantasic or not, you have an imagination.
Yeah.
An aphantasic still knows where they put their keys. They've got the ability to recall something in three-dimensional space, so
Hmm.
utilize that same structure.
Yeah, wonderful. We've got several more questions, but I would like to go just back to testing. You said something a while back about testing at the deepest level, at the identity level. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I think um, the timid hypnotist hopes their work is going to work.
Hmm.
Um, and then they won't even ask, like, do you notice a change? Can you try and recall that emotion? It's just kind of like, okay, here's some homework, go away. And then I think it's a confident presupposition if you're testing the result. When I was working with phobics, I would want them, if they're afraid of spider, I'd want them to attempt to hold a tarantula, and I think a lot of those things. Now, how I like to test that is in a form of future pacing, rather than say you will see the future version of you doing exactly what you want.
Hmm.
I would say there's this element of saying, right, and now when you think of the future, what's different? And that has a presupposition that there is a change
That there is a
in
change.
that,
Yeah. Mm.
and the thing that's derailed you in the past, now when you think of the future version of that self, how does it deal with it differently is a nice suggestion. And then
Yeah.
if it's successful, because all of these things, like everyone has good intentions in the moment, but you want to
Mm.
future pace it contextually to the environment where
Yeah.
they are. So then it's a case of, right, if they are able to kind of avoid the pitfall that they've fallen in many times before from a disassociated, why not associate that? And then
Mm.
imagine they're in a first person perspective. the very thing happens that has kind of derailed them before. And now is it different? And
Mm-hmm.
nod your head if it's different, shake your head if it isn't. And if it
Mm-hmm.
isn't, you go back and find a different version. So that you can, there's a great phrase in science, which is in vivo and in vitro,
Mm-hmm.
in the test tube and in reality. In my mind, like you want to test the work inside their own imagination first,
Mm-hmm.
and then set the homework to be right. The homework isn't to make sure you do this thing, because that's just another thing they have to do, is make a note the next time you're in this situation, note down what happens. It has a
Mm-hmm.
presupposition that there will be a positive change, but you're not giving them something to do because they've already tried to use, all the shoulds and the structure and all of that kind of stuff. So it's a good idea to test it within their internal experience first and then encourage them to test it in reality,
Mm-hmm.
because then it gives them the connotation almost of a post-hypnotic suggestion that when they're in that context, something's going to be different
Mm.
than it normally is.
Yeah. Do you use any anchoring?
I don't think you cannot use anchoring. I think, anchoring, is the NLP version of kind of conditioning,
Mm-hmm.
or lots of people like using the word triggers a lot. These, it's all of those kind of things. And I think that's why the very first level of disassociation, I want to be in a place where they have positive experience, because I'm trying to anchor resourceful states.
Right.
The classic anchoring of finger and thumb together, when you think of that, I don't tend to do very much of that. I tend to
Mm.
use, because I love using mnemonics, what I will use is go back to a time where you felt really, really resourceful. And then I'll say, right, make sure that version of you disassociated has that resource. See yourself with courage, see yourself with discipline. When you're absolutely certain, let me know by nodding your head. They nod your head. Step into that. Where do you feel that courage in your body? And normally courage, they normally place around the chest or the heart. And I
Mm.
say, right, imagine a three-dimensional shape in that specific place. Does it spin? Does it glow? All the submodality
Mm.
stuffs.
Yeah.
Give it a sound connected. Think of a posture that you are naturally in when you feel that way. That's what I want to anchor. I want the anchors to be organic and natural, but then they can add to it if they think of that shape moving in that way, feeling in that way. That can be a nice additional. But for me, specificity is the key thing to make an anchor work. And unfortunately, too many people will use this kind of finger and thumb
Mm.
thing, or the clenched fist for too many things. Actual anchors will be something slightly different. That will be, someone gives them a look, or, they're in a particular context. And anchors are a lot of the things, particularly when people are faced with habits and kind of behavioral things. It's the trigger that causes them to feel that way. So we want to kind of
Right.
change that element.
Mm-hmm. Right. So now we've got lots of questions here. Love your creativity, Adam, says Steve. Um, that's true, Steve. Thank you. What is the best way to structure and safely close nested loops so that the client stays oriented and the suggestion lands ethically?
Yeah,
Colin
it's a
wants
great
to know.
question. So I mentioned the kind of Hansel and Gretel metaphor. One way of doing it is that you go back in reverse order, and then the
Mhm.
mnemonics help you know where you are in that location. So if level 6 is a hologram of seeing your future self, well, then you leave that hologram and then you go back to the next level up through whichever device got you there. So if they
Mm.
arrived there on a fireman's pole, climb up the fireman's pole. If it went through a door, have them go back through the door. You want to keep
Mm.
the way that they got there, because that becomes your breadcrumbs to enable you to
Right.
find your way back. So that's a useful way of thinking about it. Um, there is a get out of jail free card that I have, though, that and sometimes people think, like, what happens if you can't go back in the specific order and close all the loops? And it's kind of like, okay, it's not ideal to do that, but it isn't going to ruin the client if you do.
Mhm.
Like, you've heard a bit of gossip and never got the answer as to what actually happened. You've seen a cliffhanger and then never saw the next episode. We don't die if there's an open loop that never gets closed. Like, so
Mhm.
it's not detrimental. It's just, if you can do it, great, unless you specifically want the open loop to create a post-hypnotic suggestion. So you might say, and the um, the realization or the insight will either come to you now, or it will come to you when you very least expect it. Okay,
Mm.
well now we've got an open loop, because if it hasn't come to them in that moment, there's now an open loop. But the open loop is they're going to get some kind of valuable insight coming their way.
Mm.
And if they do, great, that becomes confirmation bias. And if they never do, they'll just forget about it. But my kind of element of, let's say, a get out of jail free card, to use a Monopoly metaphor, is a phrase which is something along the lines of, and then you realize that all of this is just thoughts within thoughts, dreams within dreams, ideas within ideas. And your unconscious is willing to take all of that back into the here and now. And when you're ready, let me know. So you can kind of do that. And it's almost like a catch-all to kind of mean that you don't have to kind of remember
Yeah.
every single kind of thing, because some people won't get every single kind of open loop closed. But I think if you make it that you feel like you have to kind of go back in exactly the reverse order. One of the things that I like to do, and I did it recently with a hypnosis session, is you can make the nested loop circular rather than require it goes back in reverse order.
Right.
So it was there was a guy in his first level of dissociation was the forest. So rather than kind of level one, level two, level three, level four, and at the end go back in reverse order, at the end there was a way to kind of get back to the forest, see himself
Mm.
with all the changes that he made. So I just made it
Hmm.
circular rather than reverse order. And the expression on the face, because he wasn't expecting it, was just kind of like, it's kind of like you get to see yourself from the perspective of someone else. So
Yeah.
most how it's taught normally is you go in reverse order with nested loops, and you close all the
Mm.
loops on the way back. You don't have to do that, and you can just kind of, you could use an element of, let's say, floating disassociation. You hover up over yourself, and as you go back, see all of
Mm.
the previous levels that you've been in, go back to the beginning, allow your mind to close any unfinished business, and then kind of arrive. So there's ways of doing it. I remember a couple of clients where there was a fire alarm that took place, and there was no way that I could have the time to kind of to do that. So that
Yeah.
phrase of, you know, um, you realize that all of this is just, and that nominalization of just, it's
Just,
just
yeah.
thoughts within thoughts, ideas within ideas. Basically, in the same way that when you wake up from a dream, there's normally open loops in a dream.
Mm.
It doesn't ruin your day. There might be a really vivid open loop, and you're like, oh, that's sometimes why people want to get back to sleep after the snooze button's been pressed, because they've
Yeah.
got that open loop. But it doesn't destroy a human if there's an open loop that isn't closed. It's just sometimes a little bit frustrating.
Mm. No, I get it. Okay, wonderful. We've got lots of new questions. Um, Dale says, I believe that clients structure their problems as open loops. Too much choice or closed loops has to be one way or another. Do you ever choose to keep a lot of loops open to give the clients the frame of to discover new possibilities outside of the session?
Yeah, I think I think it's a great point, Dale. Firstly, a lot of people are binary, and they've taken all of this kind of, like for example, like someone's had a toxic relationship, and they come to the conclusion of all men are bad, no men can be trusted. Why? Because it gives certainty. You don't have all this nuance, you don't have that cognitive challenge of figuring out. It's simple based on kind of what things are. So
Mm.
completely agree, Dale. Some people deliberately will engineer the belief systems to have certainty through closed loops, and other people feel overwhelmed because everything feels like the head of a hydra, that whenever you chop one head off, like two more heads grow. And it's like, how do you ever do that? And I think a lot of anxiety comes from too many open loops. If you are asking yourself a what if question, and that what if is something horrible happening, what many people do is they jump into the future and try and deal with a situation that can't be resolved because it's not actually real. And every
Mm.
time they deal with that situation, more nuances come up in that, and it can create a lot of things. So I think
Yeah.
Dale's absolutely right. Like open loops can be a cause of issues, and I think closed loops can also do that. It depends. If someone is fixated, like there only has to be one way, and that's the problem, creating choice and possibility is that. is that way. One of the metaphors that I quite like to give people an idea that there is more choice is the idea of a multiverse. And I say, just imagine that there are infinite other versions of you, and let's visit the one that's already figured this out. And that has the connotation of every single variation that possibly could exist of them. Someone's already found a way, and then we can kind of go to that. Now, you can use that within a nested loop. You could use a four-dimensional device like a wormhole. Let's visit a different reality, but this is you, it's your genetics, is virtually your background. But one key thing is different. They've already resolved this issue. Let's see what they did to get to that point. And it gives them permission to not make it about them and carry all of that shame and kind of connotation. They get to have this element of, okay, if there was infinite versions of me, of course, one version of me has already resolved this. And then they can get insight and inspiration, but it's easier to do from a disassociated state than an associated state. And I would agree with Dale. Sometimes opening loops is exactly what is excitement if it isn't an open loop? The thing hasn't happened yet. This idea that open loops have to be bad is ridiculous. It's and positive anticipation is an open loop. Also, anxiety can be an open loop of that thing's happening and it hasn't quite had the resolution that you want. So it's like, well, what's going to happen here?
Wonderful. So I lots of chat in the chat. Okay, where do we have more questions? If you have more questions, ask them now. We have to finish up in a minute. I have a great metaphor about the SR-71 Blackbird versus the English electric lighting. Oh God, Steve, please. Please share. Okay, no, we're going to leave that. Walking around a lake. Okay, right. I think we are finished with questions. Adam, I have a question, and that is, if you had to give advice to a newbie hypnotist, what would that be?
So one of my favorite metaphors for learning hypnosis is nobody learns to swim by reading a book. Like, you have to jump in the pool. And, one thing I was fortunate enough to do when I became a hypnotherapist, I could see people that did the same course with me, and they were fixated on their website and business cards and those kind of things. And I just wanted to work with more clients. So I would say, if you want to learn to swim, jump in the pool. If you want to be a good hypnotist, see more clients is my advice.
Wonderful. And you have a training coming up, I believe, at Hypnothoughts Live about nested loops.
Yeah, so it's this kind of stuff, but rather than the theory, it's going to be very practical. So it's going to be, right, how do we in real time structure this so it becomes, a skill at the either conscious competence level or unconscious competence level, rather than more knowledge that should set intentions as to what you're actually going to do. So we want to actually develop the skills in the day rather than just more knowledge. Like, as hypnotists, like, there's so much knowledge out there and so many things. Oh, should I do that? Should I do that? But if it's a skill thing, then we want your intuition to be the kind of almost like in control of when you use it, when it's relevant. And I would say I use nested loops a lot. I don't use it in every session. Sometimes it's not relevant. So you want to have the option without the obligation to use it. So Hypnothoughts Live finishes on the Sunday, and then my one-day training is on the Monday, all about actually learning this at the skill level.
Wonderful. Denise says, this has been awesome. Thanks so much, Andy, Adam, and Astrid. I have to dash. Yeah, there you go. Love this. Thanks, Adam. So there's lots of thanks coming in. No online course as of yet. Are you planning one, or?
Yeah, I'm going to be creating courses, so I'll definitely share that in the future. And if anyone wants to hear some of my stuff, like particularly some of the levels of disassociation, I have a podcast called The Hypnotist. It's on Spotify, it's on Apple, it's on YouTube, and you can find that. And there's loads and loads of examples of me actually doing this rather than kind of talking about it.
Wonderful. Now, we're going to put all the details into the comments and into the show notes as usual. And the replay of this will be going on YouTube, I guess, tomorrow. So wonderful to have you all here, all the participants, and Adam, especially wonderful to have you. It was really interesting.
Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of The Hypnotist. If you've enjoyed this episode or got some value from it, please give it a 5-star rating and review. And maybe you know someone that would also benefit from this particular episode, in which case share the episode with them so they can also get the benefit too. And if you would like to listen to this episode where it's just the hypnosis, so no intro, no outro, no explanation, just the hypnosis and completely ad-free, there will be a link in the description where you can subscribe at a very low cost and only get access to the hypnosis. So if that's of interest, please check that out. Thank you again for being a regular listener of The Hypnotist, and I'll see you again soon for more.